Increasingly, it's the case that having people's data is a liability. The legal landscape around user data, especially in the EU, is becoming quite harsh. And whether you think this is a good or bad thing is largely irrelevant. As a business, you need to manage the risk associated with this data. To me, this is a good opportunity to consider a thorough and holistic approach to taking control of the data that you're already responsible for. I'm Lars Wikman, and this is Underjord. This video is a collaboration between Underjord and GleSYS, who sponsored this video. They wanted to do some videos with me on the current challenges with global cloud services, privacy, the EU, and what you can do in the shifting legal landscape we find ourselves in. This video is EU-centric, but it should be of interest to anyone who cares about the evolution of the legal technical landscape and what that means for businesses that rely on software as a service providers or cloud services, which is pretty much all of us. It should also be relevant to anyone that runs a software as a service provider or a cloud service and wants EU customers. The GDPR made itself quite famous as a highly impactful piece of legislation. And in our day-to-day, we see it as these constant consent banners that are of questionable legal status, but they're everywhere. In response to the GDPR, most cloud providers added some consent options, changed their contracts a little bit, probably changed some procedures, how would we know, and then went on with whatever they were doing to a very large extent. On the ground floor of business, the impact of the GDPR is much more significant. While most companies still do business as usual, I would say that overall they are much more aware of things like collecting consent before storing personally identifiable information. The awareness level is much, much higher. What's even more interesting is what followed when the law was put to the test and we got the Schrems II ruling, which made it clear the existing mechanism called Privacy Shield was not enough to safeguard EU personal data with a US cloud provider. The US gets to stand in for the whole concept of a third country, as they are probably the most important country that has been classified as a third country. So a third country is a country that has been deemed to not provide EU equivalent privacy protections for personal information. Essentially, it boils down to this. If a company has a US-based ownership, they can be compelled by law to hand over any information they keep for their European customers, such as databases, files, or heaven forbid, encryption keys. So it becomes the case that if your US-based cloud provider can access your data, there's probably nothing they can legally do to protect your data and keep you in compliance. It doesn't really seem to matter if your provider has a EU-based subsidiary. The US still has this legal avenue as long as the company is US-owned. Schrems II completely invalidated the existing Privacy Shield mechanism for transferring data to other countries. But what about new mechanisms? There are these standard contract clauses that can be used, often shortened SCCs, and you will find that AWS, GCP, and Azure have all adopted these, and supposedly they've also implemented additional measures which should safeguard your data as a EU customer. So this muddies the waters a bit. Is everything fine? Can you go back to using AWS? My read? Not necessarily. It is still the case that if they can access your data, the government can demand it from them. And I honestly don't see how they can put you in compliance with EU privacy law this way. And it seems to be proven out in many of the cases where these protections have been tested. We've seen giant providers like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft be asked to remove all of their analytics data for a significant period of time due to their consent banners being out of compliance and essentially illegal. The Swedish Integrity Agency has recommended against using Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Teams, citing insufficient privacy protections. Austria has found Google Analytics to be illegal, and there are expectations that France and Netherlands may follow shortly, and the rest of EU is very much watching. Max Schrems, the privacy activist whose name is on that important ruling, and his organization Noib, has brought complaints against companies across the EU. So there are currently 101 cases where companies with EU-based websites have used Google Analytics or Facebook on their site, which have been submitted as complaints to data protection authorities across the EU. This will force decisions and be informed by the Schrems II ruling. It will set further precedents. This tells me that there's more coming, and that the major cloud providers haven't necessarily cracked this nut. They are leaning on the SECs, which require them to close the gap between EU protections and third country protections with something called additional measures. Whether that's actually achievable is unclear, and with their own services failing judgments left and right, I wouldn't trust them to have this solved. It may in fact be practically impossible. It can seem absurd that there's a legal hole this big in the middle of the cloud space and the entire tech industry right now. Well, tough. Absurd is apparently the world we live in, and we still have to deal with it. Then the question becomes, do you use Slack, or perhaps Google Analytics, Microsoft Teams, Office 365, really any cloud service? And does your customer information ever end up in any of those? Now, I'm definitely not a lawyer, and I'm absolutely not your lawyer. However, I think you should let this make you a little bit uncomfortable if you are doing business in the EU. So what can you do? Most are sitting still and waiting for the dust to settle. I would suggest a more proactive approach. There are a multitude of ways to simply not send data outside of the European Union. For email and calendar, it's debatable whether that's worth hosting yourself. And typically I would recommend using an established provider based in the EU. The most well-known is probably ProtonMail because they have a very privacy-first approach, but there's a ton of providers out there. I haven't tried any right now, so I don't have any I can vouch for, but this is something I will definitely be exploring. There are also the things that are too costly to do on your own, such as running a CDN, content delivery network. That's both hard and costly. Similarly, you might want to have access to a data center, but you probably don't want to run one yourself. These are perfect opportunities to turn to providers inside of the EU. Let's talk about self-hosting. This typically means running or paying someone to run open source alternatives to the service you need. This requires someone with a little bit of software and server skill, and it requires access to a server too. With this, you can run your own service inside of the EU, and you only have to concern yourself with what you're doing with the data you store, not about whether your American provider is doing the right thing. I spent 4 years running a service where the customers were Swedish preschools. This was before the GDPR, but since we wanted our customers to feel comfortable with how we were handling their sensitive data, we insisted on storing it inside of Sweden. This constrained our options quite a bit, and that's how I got familiar with GleSYS. They run servers and do the whole data center thing, so you don't have to. They did a great job then, and they've come a long way since. When it comes to setting up and running servers with GDPR compliance in mind, I believe they are the best option in Sweden. When I want to set up something for self-hosting in the EU, I will typically reach for GleSYS Virtual Private Server. And I suggested to them that we should do some videos on self-hosting, because this has been on my mind a lot lately, and I do want to move my business towards clearer and clearer legal ground and reduce my reliance on US providers. GleSYS, to their credit, were happy to collaborate on this. They're well aware of the tricky legal landscape, and they see a good opportunity to provide a great option for companies needing to leave these massive global cloud providers. They offer servers, virtual and physical. They also offer managed hosting in case you lack a particular skill set in-house. They provide Terraform for your ops people, and they provide an S3 compatible file store for your file storage needs. And that essentially covers everything I've needed. Now, they're also very environmentally friendly and certified as such. And shockingly, their pricing is very straightforward, which is unusual for a cloud provider. And even more unusual is that you can reach them both by phone and email, and they actually answer. So if you want these novel concepts in your life, I would suggest checking them out. What would I self-host? Chat communications. For Slack and Teams, I would replace them with either Mattermost or Zulip, both of which seem very capable. And I plan on doing a video on Mattermost. For Google Analytics style web measurements, my primary recommendation is skip it if you can. It would remove the ugly banner, the headache, and the risk, because it's still a murky legal area. But if you do need it, I would look at Matomo or Plausible. And the plan is to do a video, since many people are looking to do this now, and I have a particular interest in Plausible, so that's the one I plan on doing a video on. If you have more categories of services that you would like to see, let us know in comments or email, and we'll see about doing that. Since us EU business owners need to take action regardless, I prefer to see it as an opportunity to revisit some things. I see it as a spring cleaning. We throw out the things we don't actually use, we stop storing risky data that we don't need, and we take control of and responsibility for the data that we actually need and that is in our charge. With the videos that follow covering self-hosting, we hope to help you take steps in that direction. Thanks for watching, and stay curious out there.